This is a conservation book that was published by the Mobilized Women's Organization of Berkeley. And that sounds a bit militaristic. It is actually published in
It's either 1908 or 1918.
1918. This is the third edition in May of 1918.
Now, the great thing about this kind of a book is it was really intended to teach the homemaker some tricks to make up for shortages in the rations that they could get.
These, well, let's see. It explains here. The third edition of the conservation recipes is published in order to meet, as far as possible, the needs of the housewife in conforming strictly to the latest rulings of the Food Administration. They were on rationing. When I was a kid, I remember my mom talking about rationing during World War II. Same thing. You had the wheat and a lot of other products were being sent to Europe to feed the soldiers. Never before in the history of the United States had we had to feed soldiers who were on the opposite end of the world from where we were, where we had to fly it or, swim it across a big pond to get to Europe. So it meant that stuff was not there. The voluntary honor ration per person per week, meat and meat products, 2 pounds. Butter for table use, 7 ounces. Fat for cooking, 7 ounces. Wheat flour for cooking, bread of mixed cereals, 1.5 pounds. Sugar, not including sugar for preserving, 12 ounces. And that's what you got per week. Now, they're not talking about veggies and stuff in here. But what this does is we've decided we're actually going to play with it a little bit because it has substitutes. So you couldn't get wheat. They had figured out how to make bread without wheat flour, using rice flour or some other thing, and try and make it as palatable as possible. So they had figured out how to make mayonnaise without oil.
Now, some of those alternative recipes, I'm sorry, I don't think they're very palatable. But you know
no,
what?
I suspect some of this would be awful.
if the alternative is to go hungry or eat something that, to my taste, is not real good, we'd eat it.
Yeah, we actually go. I think we're going to experiment a little bit. It's talking about mushing things around and fruits and veggies and meat substitutes and all that kind of stuff. Now, they would not have had things like soy in those days. That was just not a thing. So, save your pork and eat fish and shellfish, it says. Ham, save your ham and eat poultry and game and rabbit and hare.
Well, eat poultry because that was mostly homegrown.
Yeah.
Unless you lived in the city, which is another story.
Right. Save your bacon and use eggs. Save your beef and use milk and skim milk, and use milk wisely and without waste. So that means don't let it spoil. Save your mutton and use cheese and cottage cheese. Save your canned milk, because that could be shipped overseas, and use dried peas and beans and nuts.
This is all eminently practical advice. It's a matter of how you're going to put it all together. And of course, we don't have those specific restrictions now, but it'll be interesting to see how we can make these things work.
Well, it's like when our son was in junior high school, he brought home a cracker recipe that he had, because the boys took home ec in junior high in Maine. And we made it at home, and we experimented with it. I still have a copy of it. And we fiddled around with it to adjust it to our taste. And I used to make, for years there, I made crackers on and off again, just for fun. It wasn't that we had to. It wasn't that we couldn't go to the store. But during the beginning of COVID, when there was no bread to be had in the store, and
well, at least in our area,
there just wasn't any. I mean, the bread aisle was just as empty as the toilet paper aisle, and anything that was baked in the bakery went really quickly, and I don't care for their baking anyway. Mine's much better. I went back to making a lot of the breads and stuff that we eat, and we're not huge bread eaters anyway, but I went back to making it. And I would bake a couple times a week, and that would be enough. Or I would make Like when I first started, I would bake a bunch of times, but then I'm like, this is silly. I won't make a single batch of English muffins. English muffins is something I can freeze, so we'd make a double batch, and that would keep us for a month.
Now, what about this other cookbook you have over here?
This is called the Presidential Cookbook. It has obviously seen better days. It is published in 1903, and it's called the Presidential Cookbook, the White House Cookbook. It's adapted from the White House Cookbook. And this was never intended to be an archive piece, so the paper is like falling apart.
It's not a low-acid paper.
No. And some of this stuff is not something we would even find unless we were butchering animals. Things like it says, first class includes the sirloin with the kidney suet, the rump steak.
Okay,
piece.
so kidney suet.
Suet, yeah.
That's in a pig. That's the leaf lard.
Yeah, and it actually shows you pictures. I don't want to open this too far.
No, don't.
Of cows and pigs and stuff and all the different cuts. We also have a modern book that is how to butcher. So I remember reading part of a diary from the Civil War era, or pre-Civil War, a European woman of status who came over to someplace in Georgia or South Carolina, and she was complaining that the people who were there running the kitchen didn't know anything about butchering properly. They were just hacking off meat off carcasses. And she was having come from a properly educated group of people in England, I believe it was accustomed to people who knew how to butcher properly. And we have unfortunately had access to meat once or twice that somebody literally hacked apart. And the reason you don't do that is because different cuts on an animal are designed to be cooked differently, and you can wind up with stuff that's very unpalatable from what was actually good meat to start with. So we have always butchered the way it should be.
Well, at least one way it should be.
Yeah, well, in terms of cuts and how to maximize usage and cut the meat in a fashion that when a roast is a roast, and this can be fried, and that can be handled this way and that way. So we know what we're supposed to be doing. But having something on hand that gives you that kind of information, and like I say, we have a modern butchering book that gives all the cuts and how to take it apart and everything else. I have never butchered anything personally large, mostly small stuff like birds and rabbits and hares. But even with that, you can look at the muscle bundles and you know how to handle things. So if you think you might ever need that, I mean, it's on the shelf. It's on the shelf. The internet can be down. The whole rest of the world can be down.
Your computer could be dead.
Your computer could be dead, but it's on the shelf. As long as I still have eyeballs and there's some light, we've got the information.
Well, I hope this gives you some kind of an idea about the kinds of books that we tend to keep. This is 3, 4, 5, 6. This is 7 books out of our collection of a few thousand volumes. We have all manner of different books for a lot of different reasons. Some of these books were bought brand new retail many years ago. Mm-hmm. Some were bought at yard sales, some were bought from thrift shops, some were bought from secondhand bookstores.
Well, we used to hit, back in the old days when every decent mall had a bookshop, we would hit the, what they call coffee table books. And you would be surprised at what you would find sometimes as coffee table books. That The Way Things Work book is a classic example of that one. It was actually intended for kids.
Right.
But it's got enough information so that if you're trying to develop a basic understanding of how something works, it's right there. You're not going to become a nuclear physicist by reading this book.
No, I don't think so.
But you might understand how a transmission works. Or you might understand something else simple like how to use a lever. Because if you haven't been brought up around that sort of thing, maybe it doesn't come to you. Jack is snoring. I don't know if you can hear him or not. It may not come to you intuitively. I mean, some people have a natural knack for looking at a problem and figuring out how it works. Others don't. And it can be just the right amount of information sometimes to give you that clue maybe it's not the ultimate solution. Maybe you do need to go on the internet or to a different book and figure out more details, but it gives you a place to start.
A lot of these books can be used to calibrate what you believe versus what you know.
Mm-hmm.
When I use the word know, I mean that there's a way to test your knowledge that results in an unambiguous, definitive answer. Belief is, I believe something. It's not that I know something, and that's important because when you start looking at using the internet and a lot of websites have belief in them. There's nothing the matter with belief. Belief is perfectly fine. But you want to make sure that when you're making a decision about how you're going to cut up an animal, that you're doing it based on fact, not just belief.
Right.
A lot of people, especially modern people, I guess we're all modern for that matter, look at one occurrence and they say, oh, that's interesting. And they see a second occurrence and they say, that's the way it must work. So now I extrapolate that and say, that's the way it always is.
Right. Nah, that might be, I mean, we're seeing that with a bunch of the people who are living in southern Arizona right now. They are relatively new on their property. They're talking to people who've only lived in the area for 4 or 5 years, and they are drawing a conclusion that this is the way things are always. No, I can tell you that in living here 17, almost 18 years, no, that's not the way. The weather has changed dramatically lately, and some of the things that are happening now that are shocking the bejesus out of people down south are things that were normal when we first moved here. When we tell somebody, be prepared for something, they'll say, oh, well, this never happens. And then they get caught with their pants down around their knees, and they're wondering, how did this disaster happen? And all their friends who have only lived there for 4 or 5 years are going, oh my gosh, this must be a once-in-a-century event.
This never happens.
This never happens. And it does happen, and it used to happen every 2 or 3 years, sometimes every year. You know, you have a 100-year flood, okay? Some places in the United States have had a 500-year flood every year for the last 5 years or 10 years because some of our data doesn't go back far enough.
Well, in fact, let's talk about data real briefly, and then we're going to have to get going because you have a newsletter to finish. Yep. I have some videos to edit.
Yep.
We have dinner to fix.
Yeah.
So
the dog's going to want dinner at some point when he wakes up.
Where were we?
We were talking about data.
Yeah, data. You've heard Irene talk in the past, and I've talked a little bit about it. She keeps a weather log and has kept a weather log here for almost 18 years. She's kept records of the gardening that we do. So whenever we start thinking, it must be like this, we can quickly determine by going back through those logs and say,
was it really like this?
Was it like that? Did we really have that much heat? Did we really have that much cold? Now, there's some things that stick out very, very boldly in my mind. For example, about 14 years ago, we had sub-zero weather for the better part of a month. And our water line from our tanks froze. Now, that water line is buried 2.5 feet deep. It took days.
Yeah, and it wasn't the whole line that froze. It was only pieces of it. But it still, it took days of digging.
So I know for a fact that we can get really cold here. I also know for a fact it can get really hot here. So I no longer say, oh, well.
That never happened. Oh, it couldn't happen. And we always joke about never say, oh, it could never get that bad, or, you know, what could happen now, or any of those other foolish things.
That's when it's going to happen.
That's when it's going to happen, you know. Oh, you know, people who are complaining about it raining. Okay, first of all, rain in the winter in Arizona is a blessing, a total blessing, because it keeps the soil more moist. Now in the spring, it's a danger, because it means that we'll get a heavier cover of grasses and other weeds and stuff like that, and it is very important to keep your stuff cleared because you have to have a defensible space. But if we don't get that water during the winter, that means we start the season with a deficit.
which is not good for the garden, is not good for our trees, it isn't good for anything.
Yeah, it's when you start seeing the wild trees dying. It's when you have trouble giving your own trees enough water to keep them alive. It's when the jackrabbits get hungry enough to stand on their hind legs and strip the trees as far up as they can reach, which is usually about 4 feet. So if you have any kind of fruit trees and you can't keep them off of it, they're going to ruin the trees.
The trees will be dead. But you know what? Got to say goodbye, Irene.
Yes. So be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because obviously we have lots going on, and we're always thinking about things, because that's what we do. We have lots of intellectual conversations sometimes.
The question I always ask them, and Irene and I were talking about this morning, is how do they know that?
Yes.
Not how do they believe that?
Right.
How do they know that?
Right.
So I encourage all of you to ask yourself that question of how do I know that?
Right.
Is there a way for me to test that and make sure that that thing is true?
Right. You know, if you want to know, we were given inaccurate information about the weather in this area by the weather services. We're in an odd area. If you look at the weather from Williams, they're 1,000 feet higher than we are. If you look at the weather from Chino, it's 1,000 feet lower than we are. The National Weather Station in our area is 8 miles north of town, which has virtually nothing to do. I mean, it's sort of, but it's more accurate than Williams, but not much. It's off by anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees at any season of the year. They get different rainfall than we do here. We get more rainfall than people who are 2 miles from us because of the microclimates and the fact that we're up on a hill. So it gets complicated. It really does. But never say what could go wrong, because it will. Never say it can't get any worse, because it will. And never say it never happens,
because it will.
So do your best. Don't forget to brainstorm, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.